Okay, let's get on to our next person again. My right-hand person that has really helped me to make Speakers Bureau work well, and with all her assistance and help, getting flyers out and so on, is one of our QSs from my home club, and now she's actually in two of my home clubs, Suni Gayle, and she's going to tell me something that probably I need to do, and how to be organized and organize your speeches. So let me give you her introduction. And it is, when you need to give a speech, how do you start working on it? Are you using the same strategy you learned during your first Competent Communicator manual? Were you looking over my shoulder, Suni? That was a long time ago, too. Back when it was 15 speeches, for those of you that aren't part of a history. Audiences are much more savvy today than they were 10 years ago, thanks to the proliferation of online videos. Those tried and true formats may be perceived as boring. Truly powerful and effective speeches that motivate and inspire audiences require a new approach. Suni Gayle, QS, will be sharing advanced organizational strategies that will take your speech writing to a whole new level. Her presentation is titled, How to Create a Not So Run-of-the-Mill Presentation That Will Knock the Socks Off Your Audience. I'm not sure that thought of that. All those audiences without socks is another story altogether. But we're looking forward to hearing some organizational tips from Suni Gayle. A little round of applause for Suni.
Don't know about this. We do. Oh, darling, are you sweetheart? If I were you, I'd get changed, sweetheart. Oh, give up, Mark. All right. Yeah, they love them. I hope Tim likes his kimono. Well, I guarantee he'll like it as much as that kilt he gave him last year. I'm a photographer. I'm taking pictures of people in their element. Holding socks is my element? Oh, I mean, you're taking care of your family. That's terrific. In fact, I'm thinking maybe one day I'd like
Suni, you're muted still.
Really? I've never heard you talk like that before. Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons.
We're not hearing good sound, Suni.
Those that look at marriage, see what it's like day in, day out. Make sure it's not too mundane for me.
Okay, sorry, let me manage participants. As somebody has a TV on that, I'm just going to mute them. All right. All right. Hello, fellow Toastmasters, qualified speakers, accredited speakers, and visitors. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 advanced strategies for organizing a speech and a 5-step process for how you can use these strategies in your next presentation. Now, if you're like me, this is the moment where you might think about shutting off your camera and going and getting ready for bed. Or you're thinking, I cannot take another boring speech. But wait, please don't shut off your camera yet. I promise you this speech is going to get a whole lot better. This was my opening sentence. What about this signaled that boredom was up ahead? Well, first of all, it's not a great opening for sure. It doesn't grab you. I don't tell a story. I don't make some sort of catchy statement. My speech title was unusual, and it signaled that you were about to experience something different and maybe even exciting. This opening sentence, in contrast, though, is very much run-of-the-mill when it comes to speeches and presentations. But here's another thing that you may not have thought of. My opening statement tells you that my speech is going to be predictable. You know I'm going to go through 3 strategies and then lay out 5 steps. Now, if you're a person who takes notes, you may have already numbered down the left side of your page. If you're a longtime Toastmaster, then you're probably going to keep a running tally in your head to make sure that I actually cover 3 strategies and give all 5 steps. Don't get me wrong, this is a solid, reliable way to structure a presentation, but if you really want to make an impact on your audience, then there is a better way. We all know that stories are powerful vehicles for transformation, and this is why we tell stories in our speeches. But what is the magic ingredient that makes a story so powerful? And if we were able to figure out what that magic ingredient was, and we added it to our presentations, would it make our presentations just as powerful? I believe it would. Take a moment and think about your favorite story. If you have a blank piece of paper handy, then write it down because we're going to do a little bit of exercise with that story. It can be a movie, a book, or a play, and we'll be analyzing it later. Okay, you got your favorite story? What makes a story a story? Well, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you don't have one of these components, then you don't have a story. What you have is a moment. If we get a little more technical, stories have plot structure. So there's exposition, meaning you have the setting and the backstory. There's some kind of rising action. It reaches a climax. There's falling action, and then there's a denouement or the resolution. These are things that make a story much more interesting. One of the most commonly used, most well-known plot structures is, and I bet you all are thinking it, the hero's journey. Here we have our protagonist walking along, living his ordinary life, and bam, something happens. Some sort of bad fortune stops him in his tracks. He feels compelled to go on his journey. He sets out, he encounters hardships, but he continues on. And then he reaches the top and he's transformed and he now lives his life at a whole new level. Many stories that we know and love follow the hero's journey plot line. But there are actually many different kinds of plots, and we're going to talk about some of those. But first, we need to talk about story shapes. If you haven't had a chance to watch Kurt Vonnegut on video talking about story shapes, you really need to Google him. He is hilarious, and the information that he provides is profound. There's an 18-minute version floating out there. There's a 4-minute version. I say the 18-minute version is totally worth watching. The idea of mapping a story is what Kurt Vonnegut does is he creates a graph, and on the vertical axis, he calls it the GI axis. He plots G for good fortune, which is health, wealth, and romance, and I for ill fortune, which is sickness or poverty. He then has a horizontal axis, and it's B for beginning and E for end. If we were to plot the hero's journey on Vonnegut's graph, this is what it would look like. We have our hero. He's slightly better than average, his life is, he's living his life, and then bam, the event happens, and it drops him down into this adventure, into this journey. He experiences hardships as he climbs up, but he overcomes and he is triumphant. So that's the hero's journey plotted out. That's the story shape. As I mentioned, there are actually 6 or 7 different types of plots, depending on who you ask. Christopher Booker wrote a book on this, so we're going to use his reference. This portion of my presentation is actually going to be interactive, so if it's quiet where you are and you'd like to participate in the discussion, feel free to unmute yourself and leave yourself unmuted, or press and hold down the space bar, as Jeremiah said, to speak, and then when you release, you'll go back to mute. Here are the 7 basic plots according to Christopher Booker. Overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, rebirth, and tragedy. Of these 7, 6 are actually hero's journeys. So the first one is overcoming the monster. Here, the protagonist sets out to defeat a monster, which represents evil. Can you think of an example of an overcoming the monster story? Anyone?
Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Ring.
Frodo, yes. That the Lord of the Rings actually qualifies in a couple of different plots, but yes, that can be one. Anyone else? Oh, if you're muted, I didn't hear you.
Oh, he muted me. The Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf.
Oh, interesting. Yes, the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf. The two stories that come to my mind are James Bond, there's always an evil villain, and the Star Wars movies. They're trying to defeat the Death Star and Darth Vader. The next basic plot is the rags to riches. So here we have a poor protagonist. They acquire some sort of power and wealth and a mate, and then they lose it all, and then they gain it back, and they grow as a person as a result. Anybody think of a rags to riches story?
Cinderella.
Yes, that's my number one too. Anyone else?
Slumdog Millionaire.
Oh, yes. I love that story. I had forgotten about that one. Another one is Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. The third plot is that the protagonist and his companions go out to acquire an important object or get to a location. So in this graph, you can see there's a princess there. And by the way, you'll notice that I do use male references in all of these plots. It's something that I picked up from Joseph Campbell. He said that there are no hero's journeys about women. Of course, he was saying that many years ago when he was alive, but that it has just, in my head, the hero's journey is always about a male. So my apologies if I'm offending anyone by not using both genders.
Well, if he said it now, he still wouldn't be alive.
Yeah. So the protagonist, is he still alive? Oh, my bad. Okay.
Long dead.
So the protagonist and their companion set out to acquire an important object or to get to a specific location. They face temptations and obstacles along their way. And what are some examples of quest stories?
Of course, Lord of the Rings.
Yes, Lord of the Rings.
But I also think like Apocalypse Now, in some ways.
Oh, I haven't seen that movie. So we'll agree with you.
Star Wars, maybe?
Star Wars could be?
Pilgrim's Progress.
Yes, Pilgrim's Progress, The Odyssey, and the Indiana Jones movies. These are all protagonists that go on a journey to retrieve something or go to a special location. Voyage and Return. Here, our plucky hero sets out on a voyage. He has several adventures and misadventures in a foreign land, and he returns home a changed man. What are some examples of voyage and return stories?
I was thinking of Sinbad.
Sinbad, yes.
Prodigal Son.
The Prodigal Son.
Outlander.
Outlander. Alice in Wonderland, Back to the Future, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. These are all voyage and return stories. Comedy. Now, we tend to think of comedy in the sense of humor, but Booker wanted to emphasize that he uses it to mean triumph over adverse circumstances, resulting in a successful or happy conclusion. He also wanted to point out that it refers to a pattern where the conflict becomes more and more confusing, but at the end, everything is made plain in a single clarifying event. Okay, so it's a pattern where the conflict becomes more and more confusing, but at the last minute, everything is made by a single clarifying event.
How about everything Agatha Christie?
Yes, Agatha Christie, exactly. Any other ideas?
A Midsummer Night's Dream.
I'm afraid I don't know Shakespeare, so we'll say you're right.
The Game or Fight Club. Anything pretty much David Fincher.
Yeah. I thought of I Love Lucy. It just seemed like crazy things were happening to her, and then things came together at the end. And believe it or not, most romantic comedies fall into this category, like Bridget Jones' Diary.
What about Gilligan's Island?
Gilligan is, yes, exactly. That's Gilligan.
How about All in the Family?
All in the Family, interesting. I'll have to think about that. Rebirth.
Frozen.
I'm sorry?
Frozen.
Oh. Okay, so then the next to last category is rebirth. And this is where an event forces the main character to change their ways, and they often become a better individual. What are some examples of rebirth plots? Right now, the big thing are the Marvel and DC comics. Every superhero and every villain is a rebirth story. And it was interesting because I actually drew a line going down to indicate the villains, but actually this graph is correct in that even though a villain is reborn as something bad, he's actually living a better life for himself.
Isabella in 4400.
Okay, I don't know that story, but we'll go with it. And another one?
Moses.
Oh, Moses, yes. A Christmas Carol, Scrooge. Scrooge experiences rebirth. Our last plot then, and the one that is not the hero's journey, is tragedy. The protagonist is a hero with a major character flaw, or they've made a great mistake from which that is ultimately their undoing. This unfortunate end evokes pity at their folly and the fall of a fundamentally good character. So here's a good person, but they have a major character flaw, or they've made some kind of a mistake, and it is their undoing. Can you think of any examples?
Aaron in the Bible, when Moses goes up to get the 10 Commandments, he makes the golden calf.
Oh, interesting, yes.
I'm going to go back to Shakespeare, but Macbeth.
Yes, Roxanne, I was going to say Macbeth.
Or Hamlet.
Or Hamlet. Or King Lear.
For those of us who binge watch TV shows, Jesse Pinkman in Breaking Bad.
For a movie, No Country for Old Men.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about which character in No Country for Old Men.
The guy with the cattle gun? No.
I knew it wasn't the assassin.
Well, there is tragedy in there, but there's also the hero's journey too.
Yes.
Fatal Attraction.
Ooh.
Attraction. Oh, interesting. Yes. So those are the 7 basic plots. Here's a summary of them. Can a few of you, 1 or 2 of you, share what was your favorite story and what plot structure does it fall under? Anyone?
So I have this Vanderslice. I have a question for you. Where would My Fair Lady fall?
I think it's Rags to Riches, maybe.
Rebirth.
I think there's also tragedy in it.
Well, tragedy means that they end worse off than they started. And I think she
just ended up where she started.
Lady. Yeah.
Where she starts.
Well, her father gets married at the end.
Okay. Anyone else? What's your
I think we know why My Fair Lady works so well, because it has so many different subplots.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, sounds like.
And one more person, what's your favorite movie and what plot line?
Movie Joseph in the Bible, he actually, I would say that's a Voyage and Return. He actually is sold into slavery by his brothers, and then he comes back at the end being the second Pharaoh, and he meets his father and his brothers. So I would say it's a Voyage and Return. Would you say, or what would be the?
I think that interpretation definitely works. Yes. It could be other plot structures as well. Yeah, but for sure, Voyage and Return works for Joseph.
You know, sticking with that same theme, if you will, then I would say Paul, right? Because he starts out by persecuting the Christians, so he starts out on the, you know, on the over, I guess, the monster one, and then he ends up in a better place.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting.
This is why the Bible stories work so well.
I agree.
Yeah. So what then is the magic ingredient in these stories? Well, change happens in stories on 3 different levels. The first level is the physical or the actual. If I just tell you what the protagonist is doing, then it's kind of dry and boring, right? There's this guy, something bad happens, he goes on a journey, he overcomes, and he lives happily ever after. But that is a form of change that happens. On a second level, there's emotional change. When we add in emotional change, that kind of makes the story more interesting. There was this ordinary neutral guy, something happened, he felt great fear, he felt he had to do something about it, so he found the courage, he kept going, he overcame, and now he's exhilarated and fearless. On the third level though, there's transformation. This is the story of how this ordinary guy became changed on the inside, and he was able to change his destiny. This third level is where stories motivate and inspire us, and this is where story magic happens. So I've been talking for 19 minutes now, and you're probably thinking, well, this is all good and interesting, but what does this have to do with giving a presentation? Let's talk about how we can use that story magic in presentations. Normally, presentations are about information. We begin by thinking, what's the best way to present this? How should I organize it? What's logical? What makes sense? It's all about the information. But what if we approach this in a completely different way? What if we approach the presentation as a story? Now, I'm not saying that we begin our business meetings with once upon a time and we end with, and they lived happily ever after. No, that's not what I mean at all. What I mean is, what if we design the whole presentation to follow one of the plot structures? Which raises the question, if we use our presentation as a story, if we design our presentation and it's not around information, we design our presentation not around information and logic, but as a hero's journey. And if it is a hero's journey, then who is the hero? Any ideas?
Your audience, right?
Yes, exactly. There's a book that I cannot recommend highly enough. It's called Resonate by Nancy Duarte. Nancy Duarte, her company does presentations and presentation graphics for all the top, I think it's like the top 90% Fortune 500s. And she says in her book, you are not the hero who will save the audience. Your audience is your hero in the presentation. Okay, so if the audience is the hero, then what is our role as the presenter? Well, Nancy has something to say about that as well. So what's your role? You are the mentor. Your role is to give the hero guidance and confidence, insight, advice, training, or magical gifts so that he can overcome his initial fears and enter into the new journey with you. If this were Star Wars, the audience would be Luke Skywalker, and you, the presenter, would be Yoda. So how do we do this? How do we sprinkle this story magic into our presentations? Well, there are 5 steps to creating presentations as a story. First of all, identify the plot structure of your narrative. If you're a financial planner and you're working with small business owners who have had to file bankruptcy, which plot would you use?
Rags to riches?
Rags to riches, most likely, yes. If you're presenting a workshop to high school students and their parents on how to get into an Ivy League college, what plot structure would you use?
His needs.
The quest?
Yes, the quest. You're going after that thing that you want.
Why is so much?
I am sorry, I can't hear you. Okay. And then if you were teaching a case study about Enron and the energy debacle.
Tragedy.
Yes, tragedy. Because that's the only plot structure that ends with the protagonist being in a worse place than where they started. So you figured out your plot structure. Now you need to get to know your hero. Normally we would call this an audience analysis. So you're going to brainstorm and research everything you know about your audience, your protagonist, before they start on their journey. What is their life like today? What are their pain points? And then brainstorm about what is their life going to be like when they're transformed. And you might focus on things like benefits and positive feelings that they'll experience. Once you feel like you've got a good understanding of your hero, then you'll map out their journey. And you'll notice that every journey has peaks and valleys. There's no journey where it's just a straight upshot and they reach their goal. Every story involves getting over challenges. Now, the peaks and valleys doesn't actually have to be challenges. For example, if you're doing a sales presentation, then the valleys for your audience might be their objections to the purchase, and your peaks might be your responses. So there are different ways you can look at these plot structures in your presentation. Then create the narrative, and this is where you're going to include all three of those levels. Make sure you have the facts and the details, the physical aspects of the story. Be sure that you address the emotions. What are they feeling at each stage of the process? And how are they changing? Because ultimately, the end goal is for them to be transformed. Once you've got all that, then you're ready to actually create your presentation. You'll take the different aspects of your narrative. You'll take all of the different levels of change, and that's where you'll create your slides and how you'll order your information. I hope this presentation has been helpful and that you will be tempted to try sprinkling some story magic in your next presentation. Back to you, Tom.
Fascinating presentation. Really great. We're going to show us our hands.